Of the three Pac-12 football dark horses I talked about on the last episode of Locked On Pac-12, which one has the most favorable schedule? Might be a combination of the two. Let's go.
Locked On Pac-12, your daily podcast on the Pac-12 Conference. It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On Pac-12 Podcast. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin, D1 play-by-play broadcaster. Thank you for making this your first listen or your first view if you're watching on YouTube every day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your number one source to stay up to date with the Conference of Champions every weekday. Like, comment, subscribe wherever you are listening to or watching the show. Appreciate 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts. Nice comments over there. All that good stuff. So on the last episode of the show, I talked about the teams that were the favorites, according to BetOnline, our sponsor here at the Locked On Network, going into the 2022 football season. I talked about some dark horses as well, and I didn't go full in depth with the schedule of the dark horses, but I wanted to talk about them because I think they're interesting, and then we'll get to the way that the rest of the teams are currently standing as the betting markets currently see them in relation to their chances of potentially winning the Pac-12 conference this year. And yes, we will hit every team today and where they were. So let's start with the dark horses because I think this is a really fascinating discussion. And remember, these are not teams that I think are going to win. I'm saying keep your eye on them, and should they win their respective division, either the North or the South, I wouldn't be overly surprised. I wouldn't pick them outright if you're asking for my straight up prediction, but I wouldn't be surprised if any of these teams end up emerging from either of the two divisions in the Pac-12. So let's start with UCLA. They bring back DTR for his fifth season as a starter for UCLA at the quarterback position. That's just not something, I don't know where that exists elsewhere in college football, especially now. It's just not something you've seen often, maybe ever. UCLA at 17-2 is where BetOnline last had them when I checked. Their schedule, I think, gives them a number of opportunities and just, one big opportunity overall, and that's to win the South, but a number of opportunities to at least have a very competitive record in the Pac-12 South. And you expect that they'll be there, in the mix with USC, with Utah, and with Arizona State as well. Probably nobody else down there. I can't see a Colorado or an Arizona, surprising everybody and becoming a contender. I don't think either roster is really there yet. But I think the South is definitely looking a lot stronger than the North at this point in time. And so you would think that'd make UCLA less likely to become a dark horse contender. But take a look at their schedule. And that's what we did with the favorites. Now we're doing it with the teams that are the dark horses here. They start at Colorado. That's a game they should win, no problem. Even if it's in Boulder, that's a game that UCLA should be able to win, and I think they will. The other thing to keep in mind here is you play 9 conference games, so some teams have 4 road games and some teams have 5. It's an advantage, obviously, to play more games at home because teams, especially in football, have a better record at home than they do on the road. Everybody knows that, I think. I'm not revealing anything brand new or dramatically surprising with that incredibly hot take. But they go at Colorado, then they get Washington at home. I think their roster is significantly better than the Huskies. And Chip Kelly is now in his, I believe, 5th year with the Bruins. That sounds right. 5th, 6th, something in there, in there. Then they have Utah at home. That's a tough game. I like the Utes to come out of the Pac-12 South again, and I'd have them, at least right now, as the favorites in the conference going into 2022, and then I'd have USC, then I'd have Oregon. Utah is tough, but they get Utah at home, and that's a lot easier than playing Utah in Salt Lake City. Then they go at Oregon. That's a tough stretch, right? Home against Utah, at Oregon. That's a really, really tough stretch, which is definitely the most difficult part of the schedule. But then it really starts to lighten up. You get Stanford at home, very winnable game. At ASU will be their toughest road game for sure, aside from Oregon. Then they have Arizona at home, which for them has the potential to serve a little bit as a tune-up before they get USC at home. And I know USC has a completely new team this year, and hardly any of the players from last year's team are still there, and they've done a bunch of revamping. I understand all that. USC is going to be better, but UCLA is going to be a good team, and UCLA will be at home. They don't have a great home field advantage, right? It's because the Rose Bowl is not actually on UCLA's campus, so students are, kind of here and there. But I imagine for that USC game, you'll have a pretty good environment, might be even close to a 50-50 crowd. But that's a game that UCLA can certainly win. If you're just looking at their schedule as a whole, I'd rather have USC at home than I would go to the Coliseum to play USC, which UCLA did handily a year ago, winning 62-33, and then they close at Cal. So only 4 road games is why this is appealing to me from a scheduling perspective for the Bruins. The tough part is that they have to hit both or all 3 of Oregon, Utah, and USC, who outside of the Bruins are probably going to be the 3 best teams in the conference this year. But getting 2 of them at home, I think that's really big. And if they can win one of those games, asking any team to win at Autzen Stadium, it just hasn't happened a lot over the years. And it's a new staff, but there are a lot of carryovers from last year's Oregon team. And Oregon has just been no matter who the head coach has been, the Ducks have been really tough to beat at Autzen Stadium unless you had them in that downtrodden era when, either Herbert was taking over or Braxton Burmeister was the quarterback. And, just not a fun time for Oregon Ducks fans. But it's tough to ask them to win at Autzen. But I think if you're UCLA, if you can beat either Utah or USC, which I think they could do. Remember, UCLA was an 8-win team a season ago. They're starting to add some depth in the transfer portal. They picked up an offensive line transfer. Jake Bobo, the wide receivers there. Kaz Allen's an explosive playmaker. You have DTR and Zach Charbonnet. The defense has a new defensive coordinator. I think that'll help them because I don't know how they could have been worse on defense over the last couple of years with Jerry Azanaro. So I think that when you look at those 2 games, Utah and USC, those are the games that stand out where if UCLA wins one, that makes them a legit contender in the South because you have a win not just against a division or not just a conference opponent, but also a division opponent, right? So if you say that Oregon game is a loss and, through 9 conference games, you probably have to win at minimum 6, but really 7, right? You have to have 7, 8, or 9 to come out of your division, at least for certain. I believe Utah was 8-1 a season ago, and Oregon had 2 Pac-12 losses a season ago, right? Yeah, Utah and Stanford, and they came out of the North. So you really can't have more than 2. Someone will go 7-2 or 8-1. But if I'm looking at this from UCLA's perspective, I think it is perfectly reasonable to say that you could beat either Utah or USC, lose to the other, lose to Oregon, and you could win the rest of those games. I think there is a good chance that they can do that. It's not a given. It's not, a shoo-in or anything of the sorts. That's why they're at 17-2 to win the championship. But I just think that schedule, the road games, aside from Oregon, at ASU, not a brutal environment. At Colorado, not a tough team and not a tough environment. At Cal, the Bears could struggle a little bit this year and are not projected to be amazing, though their defense is always really, really tough with Justin Wilcox. But their offense is going to struggle to be as explosive as DTR and Zach Charbonnet on their own. I think that's a tough matchup for the Bears. But those are your road games, right? You only have 4. And aside from Oregon, I just don't see any of them being particularly tough. They miss Washington State in this rotation. I think that's important because the Cougs will be a nice team. And I think it's also important that I talk to you about Built Bar. Imagine dipping your finger into that plastic tub of birthday cake frosting and then opening your eyes and realizing it's only 150 calories and 16 grams of protein. That's what it's like to eat a birthday cake puff from Built Bar. I have had one of these. Let me tell you, they are light, pillowy, sweet, delicious, fluffy bars of goodness, and they've got 16 grams of protein and only 150 calories. Go to Built.com, use promo code LOCK15, get 15% off your order. That is promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at Built.com. I like UCLA's schedule there. I really do. And I just think those road games are not that tough. And I'm not going to sit here and guarantee that they will go 7-2, but could I see it happening within reason? Absolutely. Let's move to Arizona State. It's a program that they're trending down off of an 8-win season. There are a lot of programs in this conference, Arizona, Cal, Stanford, who would kill to have an 8-win season that they're coming off of right now. But ASU, it just feels like they have to do more than that in 2022, or Herm Edwards might get the boot as the head coach. But they were 8-4 last year, 6-3 in conference play. Emory Jones is coming in, probably going to be the starting quarterback, and has won games at the Power 5 level. So the drop off from Jaden Daniels to him might not be that significant. So if the Sun Devils can, be as successful as they were a season ago and have a couple other games go their way, then suddenly they're right there in the mix. I mean, they were 6-3, so they were right there in the mix in the Pac-12 South to begin with. But their schedule, they start at home against Utah. At least you get the Utes at home, but that's a really, really, really tough conference opener. So I don't love that. And then they go at USC. Again, that's a pretty brutal start. That's really, really tough. Is it impossible they win one of those games? No. I think USC probably be more likely than Utah, just because but they have Utah at home. I don't know. That's a coin flip, right? You have to find a way to win one of those games if you're going to come out of the Pac-12 South. But then the schedule definitely takes it lightens up as it should, right? Because ASU misses Oregon this year. So they get Washington at home. That should be a win. At Stanford, very winnable game, not a tough environment. At Colorado, again, not a tough place to play. UCLA at home, that's big for them, right? I think that could be a big game, if not for determining second, but depending on how Utah shows up this year, could be for potentially first place in the Pac-12 South. That UCLA Arizona State game, at least at the time, it's had some decent ramifications in the conference in the last couple of years, that matchup. Then they go at Wazoo. That's a tough one. The Beavs at home. Big that they get the Beavs at home, and Arizona on the road. I don't think I would put ASU as a potential dark horse in the conference if you had the Beavs on the road and Arizona at home, because I think ASU has more talent than Arizona right now, though the Wildcats as a program are trending up more than the Sun Devils at the moment. I still think ASU is the better overall team, and Jed Fish is still relatively unproven as a coach, though he's done some nice things so far. But having the Beavs at home and Arizona on the road, I think that gives them more of a chance. But I definitely don't like this schedule quite as much as UCLA. But is it impossible? No. I mean, if you can pull off an upset of Utah or USC, I think Arizona State would then be playing with the sort of confidence that would allow them to end the season strong and only lose one more game, and then you'd be at that 7-2 threshold. But I'd put that one not quite as likely as UCLA. And then the other team that I talked about as a dark horse on the last episode of Locked On Pac-12 was Oregon State, who I think are underrated in the betting markets right now. And I understand that, lines are issued and then the public bets on them and they move them along, and sports books trying to make money. I get all that, but still, you can tell a lot by how Vegas is perceiving a particular team based on where the odds are. Even if USC at 2-1 is being juiced because a bunch of people are betting them, number one, the public still thinks that, and that means there's a sizable portion of college football fans who think, USC is just going to come in and roll through in year one with Lincoln Riley, which I don't think is particularly likely, though theoretically possible. But Oregon State here is at 40-1 to win the conference. That's a little low. I'm not saying they should be really high, but I'll get to the teams that are below them to wrap up today's show. But the Beavs schedule is interesting because they like ASU they like UCLA, not ASU. ASU's also got 5 road games. That's another reason I'm like, I don't know. But just because they were an 8-win team a season ago, that alone is enough for me to say you never know. Keep an eye on him. Emory Jones comes in there, could win some football games in the conference. You never know. Beavs at 40-1 to me is really, really low, but they, like UCLA, only 4 road games, and I think that's big. Now, they, like ASU, unfortunately, start with a gauntlet at the beginning, and that can be a blessing and a curse. You can get your tough teams out of the way and then start to pick up momentum against relatively inferior opponents compared to those two as the conference schedule goes on. Or you get 0-2, start to feel down, and then you have a stumble in there, and you already have 2 losses on your schedule, and then it just starts to become a little bit more difficult. But they've got USC at home. That's their first Pac-12 game, which is pretty tough. However, and this is just part of the lore and the kind of that mystic nature, just kind of unspoken realities that we have as college football fans. USC has lost in Reser Stadium before. It won't be a full Reser Stadium. I understand that. But Oregon State a year ago smacked them in the Coliseum. And yes, it's a different team. I understand that. But it's not a fully loaded Lincoln Riley, Oklahoma roster. And Oregon State, as a program, I would say is trending up. And their defense can't be worse than it was last year. I think it's going to be better with Trent Bray as their defensive coordinator. I know Bees fans are certainly hoping that that's the case. But I don't think it's impossible that they win that game because they know how to beat USC, so they're not scared of them, from an intimidation standpoint, the way they might have been many, many years ago. But even back then, when USC was number one, they've lost in Reser Stadium before. It's those sorts of moments, those superstitions. That's the word I was looking for earlier, frankly. Those superstitions, you never know. That's why I've got the Beavs on there. So they go at home against USC, at Utah. Now, they beat Utah last year. Maybe they could do it again. But just like ASU, if you can win one of those two, you got something cooking. It's going to give your team a lot of confidence. It's going to give your team, that mindset of, oh yeah, we can contend in the Pac-12 this year. And then their schedule gets really, really playable from that point on. And I'll tell you just how playable it is for Oregon State and Jonathan Smith. But all these lines, of course, are brought to you by our partners at BetOnline, the number one source for all your betting needs and sports info. You can find all the latest odds, news, and sports developments, including this year's basketball playoffs, Major League Baseball scores, fights, and even next season's NFL futures. By the way, go Mariners, as always. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline is where the game starts. Oregon State's schedule is very fascinating. USC at Utah. That's tough. But they beat both of those teams last year. Got to give them some confidence as a program going into that. Then they go at Stanford. Very winnable game. Washington State at home. That's big. I like the Cougs this year to be a solid team as they were a season ago in the Pac-12 North, and they beat the Beavs last year, but now they get them at home. I think that's important. Then they go Colorado at home, at Washington. I think Oregon State has got a better roster than both of those teams, and I expect them to win. And then they play Cal. I mean, as far as 3 games in the Pac-12 conference go, without throwing in Arizona, that's about as easy of a stretch as you're going to get, right? And so what that could allow for Oregon State to do is to start to have a bunch of momentum as they go and play a couple tougher teams to round out their conference schedule. They finish at ASU and then at home against Oregon. So you get the Ducks at home. That's a lot easier than going to Autzen, as the Beavs know, where they haven't won in a very, very long time. And they're not the only school that hasn't won there in quite some time. But if you can be 3, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4. If you can be 3-1 through those first 4 games, right? You win, and I think it's entirely possible. Stanford and Washington State, those are teams the Beavs can beat. And if you can find a way to beat USC or Utah, as you did a season ago, then you could really have something cooking here with the conference schedule, and you can allow for one more slip up and get to that 7-2 number that I've been talking about that keeps you as a contender in these Pac-12 conference divisions, right? So Colorado, Washington, Cal. I really think that could be 3 straight wins. No matter who you're playing, even if they're teams that are not going to be the strongest in the conference, 3 wins against conference opponents in a row, the Beavs could pull that off right there. And that just has to give your team a bunch of good vibes going into at ASU and Oregon. And, it wasn't a close game, and then it was a close game against the Ducks last year, but playing at home, where the Beavs won last time they took on the Ducks in that fog game in 2020. Beavs got the better of Oregon that year. They can beat them at home, and that's another reason that I put them on here. So that's it for the dark horses, and we round out the show today with everybody else. So Oregon State is not the lowest odds to win the Pac-12 championship. There are a few below: Cal, Stanford, Colorado, and Arizona. And interestingly enough, and Washington State is among them as well. I like Washington State, and I considered putting them in here as a dark horse, but I ultimately went with the Beavs because I know what I'm going to get from Chance Nolan more than Cam Ward. Now, I think Cam Ward has the potential to be a really good player for the Cougars this year, and Coach Dickert up there in Pullman. But it's always a little bit of a question mark. I have to see at least a couple games early in the season before I can make a determination. Okay, yeah, they could do it, right? Because sometimes guys go from the FCS level to the FBS level and they're able to make the jump, and it's fine. Other times it's a little bit of a struggle, and that's true at every position, especially at quarterback. So that's the only reason I hold off. I like Cam Ward a lot. I just can't, put him right now as a dark horse without knowing what I'm going to get from that position. But here's what I don't understand. Washington is 11-1. What Washington is 11-1. That number is absurd. I love our partners at Bet Online. Very grateful that they sponsor the show. I don't know who came up with that number. I don't know how they got it. It doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't make any sense at all. They were 4-8 last year. The Beavs were 7-6. Oregon State has a new defensive coordinator, but the same head coach and offensive staff. They have a returning quarterback to an offensive system that is not going to change. Whereas Washington is undergoing a coaching change. They don't know who their quarterback's going to be. They lost a couple of NFL caliber players from their defense, which was their hallmark a season ago in a 4-8 year. So it's obviously going to take at least a little bit of a step back, even though I still expect it to be competent in the Pac-12. How do you put Oregon State at 40-1 and Washington at 11-1? I don't get that at all. I think the Beavs will be much better than Washington this year. I expect that. I think in the North, it's Oregon 1, and then I think Washington State, Oregon State right below them at, honestly, I'd put the Beavs in front of the Cougars for the reason I just mentioned. I know what I'm going to get from Chance Nolan more than Cam Ward. I think Cam Ward's ceiling is higher, but his floor is also lower. So at this point in time, that's why I would put the Beavs ahead of the Cougs at this particular moment. And I just 11-1. I didn't understand that at all. Right. So according to the odds they stand, it'd be USC, then Oregon, then Utah, then UCLA and ASU, and then Washington. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe the betting markets love new coaches for some reason. And maybe that's why Oregon and USC are above Utah. I don't get that at all whatsoever. I think it's absolutely absurd. I think I like Kalen DeBoer. He beat one Pac-12 team a season ago, almost beat another. He almost beat Oregon and Autzen, which, as I was saying, very, very hard thing to do. Few have accomplished said feat in recent memory. I'm just saying I think that Washington's got a longer ways to go as a program compared to where Oregon State is, where the Beavs, I think, should expect to at least be mildly competitive for a Pac-12 North title. So I couldn't believe that. But, the final teams that are on there, you got Cal at 66-1. The final four teams here. I don't think any of these teams can win it this season. Can win the Pac-12 or their respective division, but doesn't mean they can't have goals, right? Doesn't mean they can't have expectations about where the fans can't go into it thinking, okay, what's a good season? What's going to have us moving in the right direction? What do we want to see here? I think for Cal, you got to get over 500. You bring in Jack Plummer from Purdue to, in theory, be the starting quarterback for the Bears, and Justin Wilcox has had a couple winning seasons, but they've been under 500 the last couple, and they got off to a slow start, then finished strong last year. You got to be able to carry that momentum over. I think if Cal gets over 500, they'll feel good about where they're at. Stanford at 80-1, below them. I think they got to be looking in the 7-8 win range, or else think about moving on from David Shaw, because that if they're under 500 again, that's 3 losing seasons in 4 years, and that has not been the norm for him. And that would be, a bad vibe around the program if they can't do that again. And we've seen Stanford be one of the best teams in the conference for about a decade, right? I mean, it was a really impressive run, and it feels like they've kind of gone down to the bottom. That's why they're 80-1 to win the Pac-12 this year, as the odds currently stand. So I think for them, you should expect a significant jump, or else you might need to be, moving on from your head coach there. Colorado 200-1. I think the goal is to not have an Arizona type season. Don't go 1-11. If you find 2 or 3 wins, I think that's great for Colorado. I think that'd be a good spot, because they lost a couple players, and overall they're Lewis, the quarterback, is young, and they're just not in a spot where I expect them to contend at this point in time. And if they Don't be looking like you can go 0-12, and I think that'll be a fine season for the Buffs. And then Arizona's last 500-1. I'd pick Arizona before I'd pick Colorado this year. I really would. I like Jaden DeLora much more than Lewis at the quarterback position, so I would definitely lean towards the Wildcats there. And I think their goal: you won one game a season ago, win 3 or more. Win 3 or more games. You tell me if you're an Arizona fan, after a 1-11 season, they go 3-9, they're competitive in a couple of those 9 losses. You tell me that doesn't have you feeling optimistic about the direction that they're moving? I think that's a reasonable target for them to have their eyes set on. But anyway, fun talking about all this sort of stuff, and it's too far away. I want football season, and I want it now. But we have to wait, and we will do so. But we'll be generating content here on Locked On Pac-12 all summer long, which is why you should like and subscribe if you have not already. I appreciate everyone listening. I will see you next time, and have a wonderful rest of your day.